Okay, welcome to our second panel. My name is Chris Morash. I'm, along with Julian, one of the co-conspirators here. It's a real pleasure to have this panel on theatre. Over the last few days, I've been reading some of Yeats's correspondence from around the time that he was awarded the Nobel Prize. And of course, we're here today because, here in this building, he was given a dinner by the St. Stephen's Green Club to mark the award of the Nobel Prize. And it's fascinating in the correspondence how much he puts theatre to the fore. I mean, we all know the address that he gave to the Swedish Academy, but that's really his doing. And there's a letter to the Swedish Academy where he says, what do you want me to talk about? My usual talk is to take 5 or 6 poems, read them, and then explain how I wrote them. But I think this award is not just being made to me, it's being made to Ireland, and therefore I should talk about theatre. And really from that letter onwards, all his correspondence really puts theatre to the front. And he makes the event really about the theatre and about the Irish theatre. So that's the trajectory we're going to follow here this morning. And we have 2 people who I could not think of 2 people better suited to talk about it than the 2 we have. Patrick Lonergan is Professor of Theatre in the University of Galway. He has been instrumental in really reshaping the theatre program there, and also, I think, in putting together being involved in putting together what is the best theatre archive on the island. I mean, he's been an instrumental figure in that, along, obviously, with a lot of others. I've always admired Patrick's work for his ability to do 2 things simultaneously. He is a very, very good scholar, and there is a lot of his work which is based in that kind of detailed scholarship. His book on Martin McDonagh, his history of Irish theatre since 1950. But he's also consistently been able to write about the ways in which theatre speaks to our present moment. So the book that really brought him to everybody's attention back in 2008 was his book on Irish theatre and globalization. He's done a book on theatre and social media, and in the past year he's been delivered of a book on theatre and the Anthropocene, which is just come out from Cambridge Elements. So he's been able to weave together that scholarship and that attention to the moment. Our other speaker here this morning also has that ability to weave things together. Sarah Jane Scaife is a performer, is a director, is a scholar, and brings that ability to think about theatre through the body and through performance to the table in a way that I can think of a few other people who do. I had the good fortune to actually work with her on something a few years ago during COVID on an audio play. And I remember being in the engineering booth in Windmill Lane with her as she was sort of directing. And of course, it was audio, so we couldn't move. And it was like being in a box with a coiled spring because there was this sense that she really wanted to work with the body. And that was a time that we really couldn't do that. And I think what you'll see when she's talking about Yeats is the extent to which, in lots of ways, Yeats is not so much our contemporary, to use that famous phrase of Jan Kotz, is that we haven't quite caught up to him, I think, in some ways, and at least when it comes to theatre. So without further ado, Patrick's going to talk a bit about some of the historical context of Yeats's theatre, and Sarah Jane is going to talk about really the future.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. It's lovely to be here, and thank you very much for that nice introduction as well. So, yeah, I'm going to talk about the history, but I think that the history and the future will overlap in a lot of interesting ways as well. I guess I wanted to start with the reputation that Yeats has in theatre. So if you ask people involved in theatre, they will say, Yeats's plays, they're old-fashioned and they're difficult and nobody ever does them. And so, that was really what I would have thought for a lot of my career as well about Yeats's work. Done occasionally, but never really with any great conviction. And then I started looking to the archives to find out when the plays are done, how often the plays are done. And really, they haven't been out of the repertory since they were premiered. The biggest or the longest gap I could find between professional productions on the island is about 6 years. And if you compare that to Lady Gregory, it's far more than her. But even in the case of Synge, if you take the Playboy of the Western World out of his selection of plays, Yeats's are done far more often than the other Synge plays. So he's done a lot, yet we think he's never done. We think he's not part of the repertory, yet he seems to be. So I'm kind of interested in this question of why there's this difference between the perception and the reality. So I'm going to show you some pictures, but before I do that, I'm also going to show you some text which you won't be able to read, so apologies for that. But this is an excerpt from a program note that Gary Hines wrote in 1991 when she was the artistic director of the Abbey Theatre. And so she's introducing one of a season of Yeats plays that were done in the theatre at that time. And I'll say a bit more about those seasons in a minute, and Sarah Jane, I'm sure, will say something about them too. But in it, she makes some assertions about Yeats's drama that I think are really helpful. The first thing that she says is that he is Ireland's foremost avant-garde playwright. And she's saying that in 1991, that that's still who and what he is. She says that he should be produced not because we're sure of his place in the repertoire, but because we're not sure of his place. And I think that's a really powerful kind of statement of mission for a national theatre, that we should do things because they make us uncomfortable and because we're uncertain of what they actually mean. She says they're radically incomplete, and I'm going to try and tease out what that means over the next few minutes as well. And then she also says the thing that Chris said a minute ago, which is that essentially we haven't caught up with Yeats yet. She said we need methods of production and of reception that will allow us to come to terms with Yeats. Now, I'm not sure if that means that, you know, there will come a day when we do come to terms with Yeats, or if he will always be just out of reach. But I think what's interesting is that feeling when we watch a Yeats play that we're not quite keeping up with it. And maybe that's something we can hang on to a little bit. So the first set of images I wanted to show you, this is from the Abbey Archive. And so this is from a production of The Land of Heart's Desire. So that play premiered around about 1910. And, you know, the first thing you can probably notice there is that those documents were damaged by the Abbey fire in 1951. So when we think about that issue of radical incompletion for Yeats, it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of the records of the production are either semi-legible or perhaps even destroyed in some cases, or maybe lost in some cases as well. But what's also interesting about that image, on the right there, you have a property list from the theatre. And again, I don't know how clearly you can see it, but in print, it has the list of properties that appear in the script. So the things that Yeats calls for, like the crucifix, for example, which plays an important part in that play. That's there in typeface. But then written in pencil beside it, there's a very long list of additional properties that were needed for productions. And this really brings home to me how for so many Yeats plays, the idea that he had in his mind when he wrote the script had to then be put on the stage by the people that he worked with in the theatre. And they would come back to it and add to it and augment it as they went along. So that's one way of thinking about radical incompletion. The other thing is, this is a play from about 1910, and I look at that set design and think, you know, it looks kind of dull. You've got it's quite similar to here, actually. You've got the table and the chairs, but the chairs are not faced outwards like we are. They're inward turning, which is a bit odd. There's the crucifix on the wall, and otherwise not much going on there. But it was the year after this that the Abbey introduced Edward Gordon Craig's design ideas to the theatre, the Craig screens, which are really emphasizing the use of light to create mood. And so it's very interesting to think about what it might be like to go back into that play and think about how they were using light to stage it. And you do have a lot of the lighting properties, or the lighting design things in the Abbey Archive where you can go back and do some of this potentially. But again, just thinking about Craig as a collaborator for Yeats, I mean, we know this about Yeats in the theatre, that he collaborated extensively with people. He collaborated with Craig, Dulac, with Ninette de Valois, you know, Lady Gregory, obviously, as well. And quite often those collaborations were not scripted. So you get the Yeats plays, and we don't know how the dancer moved in Out the Hawk's Well. We don't know which bits Lady Gregory wrote. We don't know a lot of things. And in the case of this play, it has this amazing conclusion where voices come out of nowhere and sing. And they should come from all parts of the set and all parts of the theatre. And, you know, I know if I brought this into a classroom and said to my students, okay, how will we do this? They would rub their hands together and say, we don't know, but we can't wait to find out. Just that really exciting thing in a theatre of bringing something to light that's challenging is what you'd have to do. And so I think part of the reason that Yeats's reputation is the way it is that unlike Beckett, who was extremely precise with his stage directions and the choreography of so many of his plays, Yeats left so much of that to other people that we don't have those records as easily as we might have done. Other people he collaborated with, of course, were the Abbey actors and Lennox Robinson. I don't want to read out all of this, but this is a quotation from an essay that Robinson wrote after Yeats's death to pay tribute to him. So Lennox Robinson directed most of Yeats's plays at the Abbey after 1910. So he would have done The Player Queen and Words Upon the Window Pane and the two Sophocles plays as well. But he talks here about how Yeats would come into the rehearsal rooms while Robinson was trying to get these plays up on their feet, and says he would spend half an hour getting some movement or piece of business to his liking and would cry out in a passion, never in a temper, when things weren't the way he wanted them to be. And talks about how he was completely lucid in his explanation of what he wanted, but he nearly always demanded something beyond our capacity. There's so much you could say about that. Directors in the room would probably say, okay, you never let a playwright do that in a rehearsal room. Never. You just don't. Because he's undermining the director. But also he's asking the actors to do things that they can't actually do, which again is something that directors shouldn't do. And I think it's an interesting statement because, again, we sometimes see that as a flaw. Like it was repeatedly said, particularly in the 30s and 40s, that the Abbey Company were not the best company to do Yeats's plays because their strengths were in putting on O'Casey kind of plays, urban realism. And, I think we need to perhaps see that maybe the strength of the company was different from what Yeats was trying to achieve. And that's not their fault and it's not his fault, but it is something we can document and think about. A company that was good at doing what Yeats wanted to do, however, was the Gate Theatre of Edwards and McLemore. There's a lovely story of Lady Gregory persuading Yeats to meet McLemore in 1929. And McLemore showed up late because that's the way he was. And Yeats scolded him for being late because that's the way he was. But then told him that he was a wonderful actor, and this almost brought McLemore to tears. But he had a long kind of infatuation with Yeats's work, as shown by the way in which he wrote his own version of Diarmaid agus Gráinne, first in Irish, then in English at the Gate. He wrote a Yeatsian play in 1940. But this photograph that you see here, that is not Robert Plant in an early Led Zeppelin rehearsal, but in fact is McLemore in 1953 in the Countess Kathleen at the Gate. And, I look at that, so he's playing Ailill, which is one of these early Yeatsian alter egos that you get in the plays. But he's also playing Yeats. You just look at that picture there, the hair and the gaze. It's like those portraits of Celtic Twilight era Yeats in the 1890s in particular. And in fact, later in the 1960s, in some of his one-man shows, McLemore played Yeats, literally, as a character. So I think that's kind of interesting. And McLemore, again, wrote a lot about the kind of style of acting that would be needed to stage the plays. But probably the leading interpreter of Yeats's plays in the 20th century, certainly after his death anyway, is Mary O'Malley from the Lyric Theatre in Belfast. So Mary O'Malley set up a theatre company in Belfast, basically in her home in 1951, but immersed herself in staging plays, training actors. And this is realised in the opening of the Lyric Theatre, the building, in Ridgeway Street in 1967. And over the 30-year period that Mary O'Malley was in charge of that theatre, they staged all of Yeats's plays. And she did that partly because she believed that doing Yeats was an excellent way of training actors. And she said this, and it sounds like a put-down, but it's not. She said, if you can do Yeats, you can do anything. And she really used that ethos as a way of bringing actors through. And again, there's something we need to think about there, is that so many actors from that period of the 50s right up to the 80s who came from the North had Yeats in their bones and in the way they moved and the way they spoke because of Mary O'Malley. She was also very faithful to the plays, so this is, I'm sure most people can guess, that's from At the Hawk's Well in 1960. And you can see that it's channeling some of those Dulac designs, but also that there's not a lot of space because it was her house where she was staging these things. So the emphasis on the vocal delivery of the lines was very important for her. When the theatre opened its building in '67, its Articles of Association committed the Lyric to staging at least one Yeats play every year. And they kept it up until 1981. Now, you can look at that two ways. Compulsion is never a good sign. If you have to, say to people, you must do a Yeats play, then implicit in that is that they don't want to. But for many years after 1967, they actually did several of his plays, often with a variety of interesting actors and directors as well. At roughly the same time, though, at the Abbey, Ria Mooney was doing really important work for Yeats as well. So on the right, we see, this is just an example of some of Ria Mooney's notes for productions of the plays. So Ria Mooney started at the Abbey as an actor, became its artistic director in 47 or 48, I forget exactly which, until 1963. And she's so interesting for Yeats's plays because, again, like Mary O'Malley, she stages Yeats as a way of introducing then young actors. So Ray McAnally appears in a Yeats play in 1948. Siobhan McKenna appears in a Yeats play in 1950. Stephen Ray would appear in a Yeats play in the 60s as well, for that matter. But she's also very important for having established the Abbey Experimental Theatre in 1937. So this is a kind of a subversion of the company where, again, they put on plays not because they're sure of the place in their repertoire, but because they're not. And so she stages two plays by Jack B. Yeats, but also takes another look at some of Yeats's work that had been forgotten or neglected, like The Dreaming of the Bones, which was done once during Yeats's lifetime, and she brings it back and breathes new life into it. So she finishes at the Abbey in 1963, and thereafter, for about 20 years, there's a bit of uncertainty about how to do the work. And I wanted to show you this image. This is from 1965, and it's from Deirdre, directed by Frank Dermody. And without disrespect to anyone, it's an example of the problems of trying to stage Yeats in the Abbey style. So you can see there, they're doing the Celtic thing with a style of realism, and it's very literal. And those kind of melodramatic, I'm very cross gestures there. You might be able to see it there as well, but the third figure just in the background there, I've had students look at that and say, is that somebody in blackface? And the answer is, well, yes and no. I mean, it is somebody wearing black makeup, but it's a characterization of what appears in the script as the dark-faced messenger. So it's another example of that just extremely literal style of presentation that would have happened at the Abbey. But then we get the Yeats festivals. So from 1989 to 1993, annual festivals staging Yeats's plays. Sarah Jane was involved in all of them, I think.
Yeah.
Yep. And these are really important, I think, for a variety of reasons. So again, staging the plays in this experimental format, saying we don't have to necessarily get them right, but we do have to get them up on their feet. And, it's funny, I think they were so far ahead of their time as well, that looking at the press cuttings in the archives, there's just so much kind of sneering commentary where, for example, there was a Cuchulainn cycle in 1989 that is introduced, a review of which is introduced with the headline, Rambo Meets the She. So, quite snide. You could probably see there as well the sponsorship by Coca-Cola there often came in for negative commentary, snide commentary, forgetting the fact that the Abbey Theatre was founded with somebody else's money, Annie Hardiman, and she made her money from tea. And, I guess anticipating, a future where nowadays people go to a Bord Gáis Energy Theatre to see plays and operas and don't think twice about it. So before its time, in the sense that, we would see after this the Beckett festivals at the Gate, what Druid would do with Sing and Gregory and others, that the production of cycles would become really common in the Irish theatre as a way of looking anew at people. And even the kind of corporate partnerships we see there as well, as I just alluded to with the Bord Gáis, would be important as well. But the last example I want to give, this is from Blue Raincoat. So Blue Raincoat are a Sligo-based ensemble, been in business for about 30 years now. And roughly, I think it must be 12 years ago now, they began staging Yeats's plays outdoors, often in places that were associated either with Yeats or with the plays. So they've done Purgatory, Cat on the Moon, At the Hawkswell, and here this is on Ballia Strand at the foot of Ben Bulben. And so, just at the last panel, we were talking about the French influence on Yeats and how important that is. And I think it's really interesting that the company that has really brought Yeats back to life in some ways by bringing him outside and bringing him into communion with those landscapes that are actually present in the plays in all sorts of ways. That's a company of people that were mostly trained in France. So they were trained, with Jacques Lecoq, they interacted with Marcel Marceau and others. And so it's really interesting that it took a company that were from that French tradition of movement and embodied practice to come to terms with Yeats in this way. I think that's really interesting and maybe worth reflecting on. So, I guess just to summarize, for me the key thing is there is a history of production of Yeats's plays in this country and in other countries as well, for that matter. And it's pretty constant. And so, first of all, I ask myself the question, well, why hasn't that history been written or been seen? And there are a few factors. You'll notice that some of the people I've mentioned, I started with Gary Hines, I continued with Mary O'Malley, and mentioned also Ria Mooney. And so the status of women in Irish theatre in the 20th century, particularly as directors, is not something that has been written about in great detail, although that is starting to change. But again, you can have plenty of people who are experts in Irish theatre who don't know a great deal at all about Ria Mooney or Mary O'Malley. And so that's one of the reasons that Yeats's work has been neglected too. I think some of it as well is that a lot of the really strong Yeats work has happened in a place that we call not Dublin, also known as the rest of the island, Belfast and Sligo. And so, I'm from Dublin. This isn't a kind of anti-Dublin thing, but I do think that that is a blind spot we often see in the theatre criticism, is that it can be Dublin-centric, even Abbey-centric in some ways. And of course, that's changing too. And there are a bunch of other reasons, but I think there's something there that needs to be written about more. Again, that emphasis on collaboration and bringing some of those collaborations into our understanding of the textual traces of the plays would be important. Getting into rooms with students and actors and doing them, it's a great thing to do. I do this all the time in my own work. Just throw it at students and see what they throw back, and it's amazing what they come up with. And yeah, I think the history definitely needs to be there, but there as the basis for staging these plays in the future, even if we're not sure quite why we're doing it. Mm-hmm. So there's a segue there.
Oh,
yes, yeah. Thanks very much for that, Patrick. That was wonderfully rich. I think we'll hold off questions and discussions because there's a lot we can talk about there, because it just links so nicely with what Sarah Jane's going to do, because as Patrick mentioned, Sarah Jane, you were involved in that festival, the original festival back in 1989-90, but had been involved in a lot more since.
Yeah.
So I'll hand it over to you.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I'll do this. Okay.
Okay, great. And so interesting what you were saying. I had no idea what you were going to say, but all of the things that you were saying, I would agree with kind of totally. And just really quickly on the Yeats Festival in the Abbey, there were some really brilliant things about it, but there were other kind of obviously slightly dodgy things about it. It really inspired, there was a guy called Roman Pasca who created all the puppetry for one of the years, and the Yeats Festival inspired a lot of younger people to look at the work, which I think is really, really important. So also talking about France, that you were saying, it took, the company in Sligo, Blue Raincoat, the company we had, Throwing Shapes, was the same. So it had, so I'll just really quickly explain. I came back from New York and I met with a couple of people that had come back from Paris, from the Lecoq School and from Marceau School. And we were all, because movement in Ireland wasn't a big thing, and movement in theatre, so we kind of got together and we formed a company called Throwing Shapes, and we applied for European funding to do Yeats and Beckett. And we got really big at the time funding, like 40 grand or something a year, which was pounds, to explore stuff. So this was 1993 to 1996. So at the time, there was no kind of, nobody was using projection on stage or anything like that. So we took the idea of the screens, the Gordon Craig idea of the screens, and we incorporated that into our design. So we would work for about 3 months on the project, exploring how to use cameras, filming, doing all of that kind of stuff, or else working on puppetry. I'll just go through these. I'm going to fly through these. So the King of the Keough-Naughton, it was in Art House, which was this new building that an awful lot of money was put into to try and kickstart multimedia arts in Ireland. And it was a bit of a white elephant in the end, but we were in there at the beginning. So this is just a close-up of that. So I just love that image there. Now, we have loads of beta tapes of this filmed footage, which was all done in the Burren and in the Kilkee and the Pollacoles in the west of Ireland, because, again, I was looking to the west, obviously, for inspiration. So we were looking at kind of the idea of the sea and of the rocks and of nature itself being kind of like an anima mundi that Yeats, used to talk about. And the other thing, this is all I'm a bit scattered here now, but the one thing that we were really keen about was that I felt I was able to read Yeats visually rather than academically or intellectually, because he wrote the body into his plays. So I had come from studying movement theatre in New York and dance for whatever amount of years. So I was literally extremely physical. All of us were very physical at the time and very visually oriented. So when I read a Yeats play, it kind of came off the page to me because of the dance, especially the dance plays. So the idea with Throwing Shapes was to slow down the audience's perception of language, so that it wasn't looking for plot and narrative and a through line of drama so much as slow it down so it could hear the poetry of the words. But that was the idea. So this is just Dervla Walsh, you might recognise in there, who's winning all sorts of prizes all over the world as a filmmaker. This is one of the first kind of things she did. So Kaleidoscope, it took 3 countries. You had to have 3 countries involved. So we had cameraman Henri Clairon from France. We had Dervla Walsh. We had Nikos Apostolopoulos was from Greece, and we had 3 countries anyway involved, all in all. And Dervla came down, and we filmed in. You can see here as well. And this began my obsession with the landscape of, the Burren and the islands, and that kind of linking of Synge and Yeats and Beckett all together. Originally, we wanted to do Beckett also in this environment, but because everything was analog, we had to film, we had to edit then, we created music, so we recorded the music, and then we had to mix that, and everything was an enormous job, which now you could probably do on your phone. Mm-hmm. So this is Helena Frudist, who was also from, had studied in France. The pictures are not great, I'm afraid, because we didn't have great documentation in those days. This was a dancer, Mags Byrne, and Paul Johnson, who was head of Dance Ireland for years, over there on the right-hand side. And this was literally on the cliffs at Kilkee. So the sea would be pounding in, and Mags used to say she used to get off on the ozone. And, this was 1993 or 4 or something, so it was really strange to be doing this kind of stuff. And this is Raymond Keane here, and Delia Scaife and Helena Frudis. We were working with the wind and fabric and different things like that. The next one is Lemina Castle. I don't know if you know that. We had the actors were climbing up walls and doing all sorts of things. And again, then in the middle, Paul Johnson with Mags Byrne, and then the dancers up on the cliffs in Kilkee, and this one literally again on the edge of a cliff. This one here, Paul Johnson and Mags Byrne, and the sea was literally coming in. At one stage, we had one actor 30 foot up on a ledge off the cliff. We had no insurance because we used all our money on doing things. Obviously, we weren't great at documenting. But the wave came up and covered him, and we went, oh, God, God, he's gone. Like, we've actually killed one of the actors. And then the wave went and he was still there. But people literally died on that cliff walk lots of times. Another time we were filming in the pollicles. We had Helena naked in this pollicle, which are kind of giant rock pools. And the sea was coming in, and Henri had the camera, and Derva was going, no, come on, just wait for the whatever. And he ended up to here in the water, holding the camera over his head because it was worth about 30 or 40,000 pounds. But we had no insurance. This was in Lemena Castle, and again, these sections were all projected onto screens during King of the Great Clock Tower. And this, again, I'm so sorry about this I'm going to see if I can go up closer to that one. Oh. Can you see anything there?
Yeah.
And this was, this one here is, we had two screens, and like really naff screens when you look at it nowadays, but they were the only screens kind of available. So we had to get them from the kind of business end of things because we had all this money. And anyway, long story short, Art House were meant to come up with all the funding for the film and editing side of things, and they didn't. So we had to beg, borrow, and steal from everybody. So we had two screens. One would have the filmed material that we had from the Burren and the Kilkee, and the other one was a live camera. So we were operating a live camera, projected, live music, pre-recorded, and everything then was kind of done live, mixed in the studio. But you can see there the two, here, that one. So the one before, can you see the, oh God, what have I done now? Yep.
Oh. Yeah, no, it's still.
Yeah, okay. It's just moved into like a slide thing.
Yeah.
It's still fine on screen.
Yep, I know, but I can't. Oh, yeah. So I don't know, where are we now here? 11, 12. So I'll just kind of go through these quickly.
Oh, yes, no, it's not.
No, it's not moving.
We try turning it off and back on again?
No, I think we have an expert.
Yeah, brilliant.
That's what the experts do.
Yeah.
It's no.
So just while we're the plays you're working on was King of the Great Clock Tower.
King of the Great Clock Tower. So we filmed
it was all King
everything.
of the Great Clock Tower.
It was literally one
okay.
play. Brilliant, thanks. And that was, again, this was a beautiful red dress. So the camera picked up, so there were two screens in the background. And this, again, it's kind of like, you can see the center figure there with the dress. So we were really interested in shape and form and fabric and image and physicality and sound. So what we did was we tried to break everything down into all the senses and try and come to the poetry obliquely through the body and all the different senses. This was the second part of A Sup at the Hawkswell, which is a Beckett quote, second part of the Kaleidoscope project. And we did The Only Jealousy of Emer at the Hawkswell and Act Without Words 2 on the same ramp. Again, because for me, I don't know which came first, Yeats or Beckett, but both of them for me used the same use of the visual, the kinetic, the somatic, the aural, the sense, the stillness, the silence, the movement, really kind of, and Yeats talks about this, when they're all combined into one kind of visual picture, then meaning leaks out, or slips out, and you're never quite sure. And this is what I love about it, and I love about Beckett too. You can never totally grasp it. You can't say this is what he means, beginning, middle, and end, and that's it. And you can't do that. So you're grasping at meaning all the time. But that's the exciting thing, and that's where theatre comes in. This was just a picture of all those people there at the time, Jack and Helena. And these two on the far left were from a company called Philippe Gentil. I don't know if anybody knows them. They were really big at the time, a French company, and they explored through puppetry. And then the only pictures I have, this was all done in Trinity, but unfortunately we were asked to use, it wasn't student production, but we were asked to use a film student, a German film student, to record the whole thing. And when we got to the editing suite, you couldn't see anything. He had used a beta camera and just wasn't aware enough to know that the lighting was, because the lighting was so dim. So I'll show you, these are all just ideas of the puppets for you. Wow. And then, so we had 3 ramps. So it started off with scaffolding on the ground, and then we had a ramp that went up about 20 feet, and then another one that went about 30 feet, and then another one. So we were looking at the stage picture as in a painting. And when you came in as an audience, Paul Keough-Naughton did the lights, and he had a waterfall of light coming down like a curtain of light. And that kind of blinded the audience to a certain extent, so that then we would have puppets and actors. So say, for instance, if here, so the puppet had to be behind. So there were 2 beams of light. So the beam of light would catch the puppet, and then the actor who would be slightly downstage of him, but you couldn't see the puppeteers operating behind. And this was the very top ramp. We had this giant piece of material which went one side to the other of the stage of the ramp. And this was the dance of the Guardian of the Well. So the reason I'm showing these photographs is to show that, you know, we weren't looking at Yeats in a very, the kind of style you're talking about. We were trying to place things side by side and come in at an oblique angle, so that you realize these weren't meant to be real people as such necessarily. They were concepts, they were metaphors. It was a way of looking at the philosophical kind of structure of the world rather than a plot and a narrative and real people. So again, this is just the 2, you can see the dark figures behind there, so that you wouldn't have seen them on stage. And then this was Brickrew, and this morning's piece, which was really beautiful, really reminded me of The Only Jealousy of Emer, where the ghost of Cuchulainn comes, and then Brickrew comes in, and we don't know who's who, and who, what material remains of the body are there, or what's going on at all. So this was scaffolding there, and the scaffolding was, this is before the stage was set. I mean, I literally have a couple of photographs. It's so sad. But you can see the ramps there, and there was another ramp that went up further. And funnily enough, Bill Whelan did the music for this as well. But he did it, like I didn't want, I wanted to be really unrealistic, so I only wanted the wind and then the opera singer. So there was an opera singer about 30 foot up on the stage, singing all of the Yeats music and songs and introduction to the pieces. But he was going crazy. Bill was going crazy because he was saying she needs something to come in on. She needs a note. She needs something. But anyway, it was mostly wind and sounds. So it was a completely different type of music than Bill normally writes. And this is just a young Raymond Keane then with the skeleton part of the puppets. And again, from what you were saying, I mean, sometimes the actors would go crazy because the language is so dense and everything. But using a puppet frees up an actor in a way that if they were embodying the character and trying to be the old man or trying to be Cuchulainn or whatever. So Raymond was speaking through the puppet. We couldn't see him, but it allowed him to really focus on the language, you know, and to stop thinking of himself as the performer. So again, it's a kind of a remove in ways, and this is just because of the color of the costume. So this was the ghost of Cuchulainn here, and there was all sorts of stuff. It was really difficult trying to get the movement so that, you know, he disappears and all of that happens. This was what we represented as water. Again, these were about 30 or 40 foot up high. These 2 girls, they were students in Trinity at the time, and they splashed and played with water in the light, and it was really very beautiful. One of them is in London at the moment. Her name is she's a professor, which I thought was so interesting. Anyway, Aoife, is it Aoife Monks?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
Aoife Monks. So that's her there as an early. Wow. And this was, we did After That Words too, on the ramp. So it was hilarious because it was very Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin style. So the sack kept rolling down the ramp every time he tried to put it up. And in the end, he takes off his shoe and he jams it in to stop it rolling. But Raymond, he shaved the top of his head and he let his hair grow really long. He's a hairdresser as well at one side. And he would do this whole, go across thing, and he had false teeth in, and it was just hilarious to watch the two of them. But as I say, I just really wanted to show that they're both coming from that same kind of physical background. And this was just the Abbey workshop we did. There were 2-week workshops we did when Keough was there, but none of them went ahead in terms of that thing of having the confidence that you could look. So this was Brian Burrows and Aideen Cosgrove, and we literally bandaged up. Brian was the guardian of the well. That's what we were doing. So that's, again, it's to show you that things don't have to be, character driven. So this is, this one here is, we used the screen, and we filmed Brian and then put him on a kind of a mirror type of screen at the other side. But we had a hawk flying over the projected screen as well. But we made Daniel Reardon, you can see, can you see, or is it shining, that thing there? The guy on the screen and the guy in the chair are the one person. So there's a live camera. But we made a mask as the stage directions for the beginning of the play are coming, and this is at the Hawkswell. So they're saying a man climbs up or does all of this different. No, before that even, the musicians are proposing the philosophical argument that the play is. And we had Trevor Knight doing music, and it was really so cool. And Fiona McGarry, really jazz, kind of dark approach to the music. And then we had Daniel Reardon sitting in a chair, and Raymond made the mask in real time as he spoke the words. And by the time they brought Daniel out onto the stage, he was able to take the mask off and hold it. So again, it was playing with the notion of mask. So you can explore so much with these things. And did I have, this one here. Okay, so again, we were looking at the notion of the First World War and the idea that also Yeats was, what was he having dinner with somebody when there's all sorts of dodgy things. I'll leave that to you. I can never remember dates and specifics, but we were looking at two things. We were looking at who is Cuchulainn today, so in the corner over there you can see a guy. And that was actually Raymond with the hoodie, and he had a hurley. And my kids went to these Irish schools, Irish-speaking schools or whatever, and they'd all go down to Lonergan. They'd always have a hurley and a slither in the hand. And it was a real kind of macho sort of thing. And I was really looking at who is the Cuchulainn of today, So the plastic bags, to a certain extent, were kind of the streets of Dublin and that kind of hooded figure that we're not quite sure of. And they were also kind of bringing up the idea of the First World War and the trenches. That was the idea. So this I've put in it's a second year show in Trinity College, and we had 40 students on stage at one time, and it was at the Hawkswell. And again, just to show that anything is possible. So they come on stage at the beginning. We had an overhead camera, came on the screen behind, but we also had images of the First World War. We had the idea of 1916. All of those, that footage was projected on the back wall as all these young students came in their sparkly gear, as if they'd run in off Grafton Street with cans of beer and everything. And then bit by bit, one or other of them the mask is put on their face, and they have to be, whoever it is. This is just another version of them there. And then we looked at the water at the Hawkswell as addiction, and the man waiting and giving up his whole life, the old man, and then Cuchulainn coming and looking for the same thing. So we were looking at the post-colonial effects, basically, of addiction and homelessness on the streets in Ireland. So the guardian of the well, at the left here, was on this ladder, and she was getting made up at the side all the time during the play. If you can see this, the ladder was made into a kind of a tent thing with a screen, and we had shadow puppetry going on there. Again, this is just to show that, you can really explore Yeats's plays with students, because there's so much. He literally looked at everything, at puppetry, at dance, at all the different aspects. So this was one of the old men here, and Cuchulainn was represented. Cuchulainn was a gang. And then this was the guardian of the well when she does her dance that distracts Cuchulainn from, and again, it's supposedly, heroin. There's another, I will not leave this place till I've grown immortal like yourself. And just the kind of waste of young people's lives everywhere. And this is what I loved about Yeats's stuff, his plays, is if you strip away the real, you allow the words to kind of resonate, because they are so universal and they can be transcribed from the heroic age of Ireland to today. And this was Holy Mary, and she was brilliant. She stayed still for the whole play. So she was side by side with the addiction, which for me is kind of the dual sides of religion and post-colonialism in Ireland. And this is just to show how amazing it is to have that amount of. They did all their own music. The music was incredible for this, and that amount of bodies on stage at the one time, and that amount of creativity. Ugh. Sorry about taking so long.
Right. Oh, good. Thanks very much. Thanks. I think it's wonderful when you get two speakers who hadn't actually collaborated ahead of time, who complement each other so well. Because Patrick's argument starts off by saying that the thing about Yeats's plays is that they are kind of radically incomplete. That the script that's on the page is incomplete, and I think what you've shown us here, Sarah Jane, is exactly how that radical incompletion is opportunity. Is the opportunity to do so many things. And I mean, what struck me particularly looking at those productions from the mid-90s in the Burren is how contemporary they look.
I know.
I mean, the technology wasn't quite there to do what you wanted to do, which again reminds us of Yeats in the rehearsal room with Robinson saying, look, I know what I want to see here, but I can't quite get there. And in a sense, that's kind of where you were in the early 90s.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, that sense that, look, I know what I want to do with this. This needs projections, but not a kind of rickety-dicky screen. It needs the kind of technology.
At one stage, because I had gone to a lot of different countries around the world, and that notion of this play can be done against a wall, any wall or whatever, I was like, oh my God. You could have the Berlin Wall, you could have the wall that separates Palestine and Israel. There's so many walls, China Wall. If you really look at his work and, in an open kind of way, in a loose, open way, the metaphors and the kind of philosophical underlying structures are amazing, and there's so many ways to explore them, exactly the same as Beckett.
Yes.
Do you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
And yet, with Beckett, so many directors and so many companies around the world have seen that opportunity. And yet, with Yeats, when it has been seen, it's been often forgotten. That's. And I think the point that you made, Patrick, is showing us that image from that production in the 60s, that very literal production with, the kind of Cuchulainoid horns and, if the man has a dark face, he has a dark face. Just how that doesn't work, that you have to go somewhere else with this.
Yep, you do. I was wondering as well, though, I think there might be something here about how we do classic plays in Ireland. Thinking about this a bit, so, we're very good at staging new plays in Ireland. We do maybe between 100 and 200 every year. And we don't expect them all to be good, but we feel like it's important to do them anyway. Because even if they're not good, they might lead us to somewhere important. But it's as if when we do classics, we expect them always to be good and to justify their existence on the stage. And I would contrast that with opera in this country. So, here we have the Irish National Opera that will do everything from Mozart to Strauss to contemporary work. And they do those classics because they think if you're playing an instrument or you're singing or you're an audience member, you need to be able to measure yourself against the best work there is. But then we also have the Wexford Festival Opera, and its raison d'etre is to stage work that is weird or neglected or forgotten. And it doesn't actually matter if you go to the thing and you say, yeah, I never want to see that opera again. That's not the point. And, likewise, think about the UK and the Royal Shakespeare Company. They don't just do Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet. They do the weird stuff as well. They do Cymbeline. Think about how in New York you have the encores, where people bring back musical plays saying, well, everybody thought this play was terrible in the 60s. Maybe it's still terrible, but let's find out.
Yeah.
And mostly it's still terrible, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes you get things like Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods coming back through that channel as well. And so I think we tend to write off a lot of plays that are imperfect, not just Yeats, the O'Casey stuff from basically after the Silver Tassie, and a great many other plays as well. And maybe there's something there about how we think about these plays. And by we, I don't just mean theatre makers or academics, I mean audiences too.
Yeah. Could I ask you just to say a little bit about the Yeats material that's in the archive, particularly the Abbey archive in Galway?
Yeah, so I know Mairead is here as well from the Abbey as well, who might want to chip in, but the very strong holdings of material related to Yeats in the Abbey Theatre archive. So productions of the plays, there are about 14 videos of productions as well, mostly from the Yeats festivals of the 80s and 90s. About 200 photographs, lots and lots of prompt books. Very interesting minute books as well. So working with the Abbey, we digitized and have published online the minute books of the Abbey Theatre right up to Yeats's death in 1939. So you really get to see Yeats working with the actors, working with the company, worrying about money. Like, I'm fully persuaded Yeats would have been okay with the Coca-Cola thing, having read the minute books. But also just great stories where in the 30s, the actors' pay was going to be cut. And in common with what was happening around the world at the time, they wanted to cut the women's pay more than the men's pay, because they thought men and women shouldn't earn the same amount of money. And the actors came together and said, no, we pay us the same. We're a company, pay us the same. And so it was like, well, your parent isn't here to sort this out. So in the minutes, they're waiting for Yeats to come back and sort it out. And then he does come back and says, yeah, pay them the same. And it's all sorted. So all that's there as well. And just fascinating things there, parts of the story that I think haven't been told and haven't been integrated into our understanding of the fact that when he was writing these plays, he was working very closely with these people on a very human level.
Yeah. And Sarah Jane, you were involved with those Yeats productions in the late 80s, early 90s. Is there a particular play or particular production there that stands out for you where you thought, oh, we got it here?
Yeah. I think it was the second year, and Derek Chapman was directing, and I was doing movement direction, and The Dreaming of the Bones, and the other two that were in that one. Purgatory, I think, was in that one. Oh, Purgatory was amazing. And I was besotted, as you can probably see there, if anybody knows Butoh, I was besotted with Butoh at the time. And not as in, I had studied it and everything, but obviously as a, amateur, because you probably have to be Japanese really to kind of really embrace Butoh as a kind of a art form. But in the second year, we, myself and Derek, really played, and the first year, I was given 18 actors and told to, do movement with them. And one, the Abbey actors weren't really having any of it. And two, just everybody was kind of going, what the hell is she doing? I was trying to get them to do Butoh exercises, and am I allowed to be slightly rude, not rude, but okay. So I was trying to get them to breathe, and one of the things that you talk about is breathing in. But there's a point between your pubic bone and your coccyx, and you imagine you're sucking up on a straw and breathing in the air, and the air is, and all of this kind of imaginative work with breath. And one of the actors, I heard later, was going around to Dublin and was saying, Sarah Jane Scaife is getting us to breathe through our bollocks. So it was like I was coming from one kind of headspace, and at the time, the idea of moving around, or in any way naked on stage was kind of weird. But we had sand on the stage, which drove everybody in the Abbey mad, understandably. And you can imagine trying to light sand, it was bouncing everywhere. But we literally had sculptures. Bronwyn Casson did the sculptures. So it was for Kathleen Ní Houlihan. And so she had the table and just the stools or whatever, so to form a house. So the actors rolled in on the sand, and they slowly put the house in formation or whatever. And then Alwyn, who was Kathleen Ní Houlihan, was amazing. So we were going for that whole thing of the Middle East, which is, of course, coming up all the time. But she had this big scarf kind of thing, and she wound it round. And she could have been like one of the women who is, wailing because her children have died or whatever, and also that whole thing of Yeats where he felt kind of guilty, but that's almost what it felt like, that they were calling to arms, and it was so deeply moving, all of that particular time. And then the Dreaming of the Bones, of course, became just this really philosophical kind of dream, literally dream, and it was all about who we were as Irish. And then Purgatory, Alwyn and her husband at the time, David Heap, did it, and again we used the naked body of this idea in the window, that they're looking at this body, and it was just one simple movement. I thought that year was really good because it was just pared back and clean. Then the thing that didn't go so well maybe about that was, the first year especially, was I think James was trying to put too much in, I mean, Cuchulainn had leather pants, which gives what you were saying, Rambo.
Yeah.
But, and they cut the...
Was it Pat Kinavan? Was he Cuchulainn?
No, it was Ciarán Hinds, like a total gorgeous, and they made him, and I actually was performing against him at one stage, but they cut the bum out of the trousers. And Ciarán said, there is no way I'm going on stage with that. So they sewed it back in, and it was like a leather nappy. But it was great crack, like, no
pun intended.
Yeah, so you had half the Abbey actors who were, Peadar Lamb was sent off to do work with me on movement at one stage, and we spent a half an hour chatting, hour, and we came back in, and he said to James, she was amazing, I feel my whole body now. But we didn't do anything. So there was that kind of thing where, James really, he had all the best intentions, but he wanted to put every single thing in. So
whereas they need to be stripped back.
They need to be stripped back, and I thought the second year, for me, the second year worked best. And even when I looked back years later, in the old Abbey archive, which used to be just this little room with boxes of VHS in it, and I was watching, I can't, and I haven't seen it now, I don't know what I would feel like now looking at it, but it seemed to me that visually it worked.
Yeah. The quality of the videos is really good.
Yeah.
So well worth looking at.
We only have a few minutes left, but I just suspect there are some questions from the floor. There's one here right in the middle.
That's great. So thank you both so much. That was such an exciting way of looking at the work, and made me think about so much, in terms of my own stuff on Jack Yeats's plays. But I was, looking at the masks and the puppets that you, Sarah, used in those productions. That takes us again straight back to Edward Gordon Craig and the roots of where this performance philosophy might come from. but that got me to thinking about embodiment and disembodiment and the use of voice that came up so compellingly earlier on as well. And thinking about the relationship between Yeats's plays and then those radio broadcasts, that either when he's talking about productions, he's talking about Sophocles and Oedipus, or he's talking about, you know, the Poet's Pub and the Poet's Parlour, where he's really trying to immerse us in that environment. And, you know, given the group of people who are on the stage, I wonder if you might say something about the relationship between Yeats's broadcast work and his theatre work.
One of you would need to.
I think you've kind of said it, you know, very effectively, and it might be. Yeah, I mean, I think. Are you interested in the kind of the tone of voice or the way that he mediated his own work? Is that what you're thinking of?
Yeah, and the potential of the medium of radio to do some of those things which he felt that he couldn't necessarily do live and presently.
Yeah. I think so, and then the link as well with Beckett, and you know, the staging of the radio play, and just the interesting voices that come out of nowhere that you get all through his work as well. I think,
and I think, I mean, there's increasing interest in kind of Beckett and Yeats and technology.
Yeah.
You know, is toward the end of his life he does those BBC broadcasts, and he's really interested in how the studio works, in how you can use sound effects. You know, so the sort of thing you were doing with, you know, your sense, this needs video, this needs technologies. I think that's very much in the spirit.
Layering,
layering, layering.
Palimpsest.
That's right. Yeah. So I think it's that sense that, you know, you can bring various media together. And that's, you know, this total artwork sort of thing.
Yeah, and the way in which he writes about Wagner at the start of his career, I think, is part of that continuum as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I think we probably have time for about one more question. Dan.
Thank you very much. I want to pick up on something, Patrick, you were saying about the literalism of the Abbey style and perhaps ill-suited to Yeats, but you then showed some images from Blue Raincoat, and of course there were some resonances with the Byrne production. So how do you avoid literalism when it's in a landscape? What's the interaction there, and how do you retain a kind of symbolic register when it's in that setting? Yeah,
I think it's a good question that came up a lot during COVID when a lot of theatre productions suddenly went outdoors. And I think it varies, certainly seeing Yeats in those settings, also seeing Lady Gregory in places like Coole Park and so on. You know, some of the marketing material spoke about those things as if it were a kind of homecoming, but actually I think that word might be in some senses accurate, that for me it didn't literalize the symbolism, but it rooted the plays in a way that allowed the visual elements to be taken care of, and that in turn allowed other elements of the plays to come through. And so thinking of, for example, Druid's productions of Gregory in Coole Park and in places like Kylemore Abbey, what I noticed was that the simplicity of the plays was really allowed to come through, and through coming through was easier to appreciate because we didn't have to worry about backdrops and setting and scenery and so on. So I felt it was a strong compliment and not doing that business of literalizing it. But yeah, it's a risk inherent in it, though. I don't think we should always go outside.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, a lot of the landscapes you've worked in, Sarah Jane, I mean, the Burren, you've gone back to the Burren, and Inishower as well, you know, with the Beckett production of Happy Days, you went deliberately picked that kind of karst landscape, that limestone landscape, that is almost abstract.
Totally, it absolutely is. And you're not putting people, well, for me, you're not placing people in the landscape to literalize it at all. It's to abstract it almost, you know what I mean, and try and avoid any human kind of occupation at all, because those landscapes have been there. Like there's this feeling when you're on Inisheer that, you know, especially at the back of the island, that, you know, it was there, you know, forever, and it will go on. When all the walls have gone and been knocked down, that landscape will just continue on. Yeah, it's quite amazing.
I think on that note of continuing on, we'll stop. I just want to thank Sarah Jane Scaife and Patrick Lonergan for giving us a really, really rich morning here. Thank you very much.